Story 1. It was supposed to be a fun day visiting a Christmas village, just the 5 of us, co-workers and best friends, out to have a good time during the holidays. Maybe it would have been, but how could we know the house with all the lights and snow wasn't Santa's workshop? "Isn't this wonderful?" Clarissa, my wife, said as we entered the Christmas village. It really was amazing. An open field just outside of town had been turned into a big replica of the North Pole. The buildings looked like cute cottages and shops, themed with toys and candy. Coloured lights were everywhere, making the whole village shine and twinkle like a burst of stars. Actors dressed like Santa's helpers walked around, playing roles, talking to customers, and selling various souvenirs. There was even a petting zoo with reindeer, and a real sleigh with 9 reindeer, ready to take it on a tour through town for one of the scheduled candy parades. Finally, there was Santa himself, sitting on a throne atop a hill, surrounded by decorated pine trees and brightly wrapped packages, greeting people and taking pictures with them. Most of the day was wonderful. It was a crisp Saturday, and we had been planning this outing as a group all week. It was pure delight being part of the fun as my wife and friends excitedly toured the village. We did everything there was to do that day. We shopped in every store. We snacked in every restaurant and food stand. We played every game. We drank every warm, seasonal, boozy drink there was. We petted the reindeer. We took pictures with Santa. We played along with the actors and generally goofed off. It was a magical day. And then we found the workshop. "What's that?" Joel asked curiously, pointing down a narrow, unused side street. "Let's find out," Carol said, laughing and smiling. "Whatever it is, I bet it's fun." We all cheerily went along with her suggestion, singing Christmas carols as we made our tipsy way to the mystery place. What we saw when we got there was the most magical thing we had seen all day. "They really went all out here," John exclaimed excitedly. "I can hardly believe it. They even got real little people to play the elves." I looked again. Sure enough, all of the actors playing the elves were unusually short. There couldn't have been one of them over 4 feet tall. They were busily working, rushing about like they were preparing for something big. "It's cold here. Why don't we go inside Santa's workshop? I bet it's fun." The workshop looked exactly as one might imagine Santa's workshop to be. Red, white, green, silver and gold were the colours. The building looked very old-fashioned, like from the 15th century, giving it a quaint appearance. There were snowmen, small pine trees, and big candy canes scattered around the grounds. A warm light glowed inside, gently filtering out of the windows, and a thick curl of white smoke rose from the chimney like a winding cloud. All of us were feeling the cold. The crisp air seemed to have suddenly become much colder, and it only made the warm, festive building even more appealing. We happily agreed that it looked like fun, and walked to it. The elves mostly seemed not to notice us as they rushed about their work, but I noticed one give us a stern look and shake his head as he rushed on by. Something about him seemed off, and I couldn't quite figure out what it was. "Hurry!" John called as I paused to think about the strange behavior of this small man. I caught up as everyone reached the door. Joel opened it and held it open as we all filed in. Inside, it was bright and warm, not painfully bright like an office with too much overhead lighting, but comfortably bright, like an open field on an early spring day. It smelled of sugar and baked goods. The entry was an open room, festively decorated with a reception desk and a door that led inside. Behind the desk was a small man dressed as an elf. He smiled at us and waved us over. "Before you enter the workshop, you need to sign the registry," he said in a cheerful tone. "What's inside?" Carol asked curiously, looking at the door behind the elf. The little man smiled widely. "It's a place like no other," he said brightly, "where the wonders never cease and everyone gets what they deserve." "Well, I deserve $1 million, Joel said with a laugh. "Let's sign this book and get on in there." We were all there for a good time. We'd been having a good time. So how could we possibly know, how could we have any reason to expect that by signing that guest book, our wonderful day would become a nightmare? We happily signed our names on lines at the bottom of individual pages. Most of each page was covered in fancy writing, so fancy that none of us could actually read it. At the bottom was a heavy line with an X in front of it, showing where we should sign. The paper felt like old parchment, and the pen was a proper fountain pen that ink flowed out of in a dark line that varied in thickness with every stroke. Something wasn't quite right in my mind. I couldn't put my finger on it, just a general feeling that all was not as it seemed. "What's this say?" I asked as I was signing my name. Standard release, the elf said in a tone that indicated it didn't matter. You know how these lawyers are, making everything into a liability. I laughed at this, as did my wife and John. Joel gave Clarissa a mock look of alarm, and she joined in the laughter. As soon as the last of us finished signing, the door opened, and we could see inside. The ladies gasped, and the men's eyes grew wide in wonder. It was everything any of us could have thought, hoped, and expected Santa's workshop to be. It was filled with toys, elves busily crafting them as they chatted cheerfully, laughed, and sang. That's when I noticed what had seemed off to me before. Guys, I said hesitantly, these elves are proportioned like full-size people, just shorter. Good for them, John said dismissively. Now let's get in there and enjoy the best workshop setup I've ever seen. I was more worried than my friends. Usually a person with dwarfism does not look exactly like a full-sized person. Their heads are bigger compared to their bodies, and their limbs are shorter. But these actors were more like pygmies, people who are very short, but don't have the same body proportions as dwarfs. It's very rare to find many people like this, so how did this fair manage to have so many? The elves in the rest of the village are full-size people. These ones are all pygmies, I said with concern. Some things... In we go, my wife interrupted, pushing me through the door with everyone else following. At first, everything seemed normal. It was exactly as it appeared from the other room. Then a new figure entered. Look! Carol squealed with excitement. It's Santa! It looked like Santa at first. A large man walked in, dressed in an old-fashioned Santa outfit, green and brown, like the kind he wore before the red suit became popular. He was big, with a long, thick white beard flowing out from under his hood. He carried a large sack over one shoulder and a shining scroll in the other hand. His face was hidden in the shadow of his hood, with only his beard and the tip of a long, pointed nose showing. Welcome, he said in a deep, booming voice. It's time to check your signatures against the list and see if you're naughty or nice. Everyone but me was delighted. They oohed and ahed in excitement. It was the nose. Santa's nose was supposed to be like a button, not long and thin. I shook my head, trying to clear the thought away. It's not the real Santa, I muttered to myself. Get over it. I convinced myself it was just an actor. I couldn't expect every Santa actor to look exactly like the real Santa after all. It was silly to think they could. Yet something didn't feel right. This place didn't have the fun, fake feeling of the village outside. Why was the biggest, most important part of the Christmas village hidden away down a narrow side street? Shouldn't it be in the center of the village? These thoughts kept running through my mind. I wanted to say them out loud, but I told myself I was being silly, that this strange feeling of paranoia wasn't real. Joel Donaldson, Santa announced in that booming voice. You're the first to sign. Let's see if you're naughty or nice. Joel stepped forward with a playful flourish. His face shone with happiness and a bit too much alcohol from our day of fun. I'm ready for my present, he said with innocence and expectation. You will get your just reward, Santa declared seriously. He held up the scroll and let it unfurl. He read it aloud. Joel Donaldson, you are on the naughty list. Oh, Joel said mockingly with a smile and a wave of his hands. The elves stopped working and gathered around us, singing, naughty list, you are on the naughty list, over and over as they surrounded Joel, with big joyful smiles on their faces. Santa stepped aside, revealing a chair that hadn't been there before. Come, he commanded, receive your reward. The elves crowded around Joel, pushing him towards the chair, singing, naughty list, you are on the naughty list. Joel laughed and went along with it, thinking it was all part of the show. He walked past Santa and sat down in the chair. That's when the truth of our situation was revealed. Heavy spiked leather straps shot out of the chair, wrapping around Joel, trapping him. They squeezed and tightened around his legs and body, and small spots of blood began to stain his clothes. Joel screamed in surprise and pain. What are you doing to me? He yelled, his voice breaking from the pain as he thrashed his head and tried to fight the straps holding him. The elves laughed musically and chanted, naughty list, their tone growing more menacing with each word. The floor opened up in front of Joel, and a large, fancy office desk covered with papers and writing tools rose before him. The elves' chanting stopped as Santa began to speak. Joel Donaldson, he announced in a voice that was both businesslike and filled with malice. You have been a naughty boy. You have been stealing from your employer, using your position as an accountant to move money from the business to your personal accounts. I've done no such thing, Joel insisted. Let me out of here. I swear I'm going to sue you. The rest of us were too stunned to move or speak. What could we do? This was supposed to be a fun, safe day, just 5 friends enjoying a fair. We couldn't process this sudden change, and we stood in horror as the scene unfolded. Santa laughed at Joel's threat. It was a deep belly laugh, but it was filled with such malice that I hesitate to call it a laugh at all. The straps tightened and moved, scraping across Joel like sandpaper, tearing his clothes and skin. He thrashed and screamed in pain, blood beginning to flow more freely. An elf walked up and placed an old quill pen in Joel's right hand, then slid a leather-bound ledger across the desk in front of him. Joel protested and dropped the pen. The straps tightened and scraped him more in response to his defiance, before the elf picked up the pen and put it back in his hand. Your punishment is to find the errors and correct the balances in these books, Santa said firmly. Every one of them is the result of a dishonest man lying and abusing his position to steal, just like you. I know you're used to different tools for your trade, but you'll have to complete this task the old-fashioned way. Joel gritted his teeth in pain and asked, "And if I refuse?" The straps raked him again, making him scream. Santa chuckled evilly. "If you refuse, the straps will punish you. If you make a mistake, the straps will punish you. If you fall asleep, the straps will punish you. Make enough mistakes, and the straps won't stop. They will drag across your body and tighten until they have cut you to ribbons." "No!" Joel screeched as the chair slammed forward so hard that he would have hit his head if his torso had not been tightly strapped to the chair, pinning him against the desk. "Naughty list, naughty list," the elves sang again. "You are on the naughty list." I watched as Joel reached forward with a shaking hand and took hold of a paper sitting atop one of the large piles. When he pulled his hand back, a bunch of the papers fell to the desk, and the straps on the chair reacted, slicing across his body like a belt sander. Santa's booming laugh drowned out my friend's screams as the door to the next room opened. The 4 of us who were still free to move screamed in unison and ran back to the door we came in through, desperately trying to escape this nightmare version of Santa's workshop. It was sealed shut, refusing to open no matter how hard we pulled, pushed, or battered against it. The only response to our screams for help was the laughter of Santa, accompanied by the joyful singing of the elves as they continued their refrain of condemnation. "You must go forward," Santa commanded. "Go forward and receive your just reward." We continued our futile attempt at escape a while longer, but stopped when the elves crowded around us and began to push us to the open doorway to the next room. "Just reward, they chanted. Joel screamed again as the wicked chair responded to some error he made, and I knew then that he was never meant to survive the task set before him, but to be slowly killed as he desperately tried to complete an impossible task. The 4 of us tumbled through the door and into the next room to the sound of booming laughter over chants of "just reward." The door slammed shut behind us as the lights came on, bathing us in a gentle glow while we desperately pounded at the closed door, screaming to be let out. The sound of many people talking stopped us, and we turned around in morbid curiosity to see what was going on. The room was filled with people stuffed into old-fashioned telephone booths. They were babbling nonsense into the receivers with pained looks on their faces. Once in a while, one of them would drop the phone in a coughing fit and spit up a great gout of blood before picking the receiver up again and babbling some more. A column of elves filed into the room from a hidden door, wicked smiles plastered across their faces. They went about the room checking the phone booths, performing repairs, and washing out blood by connecting a hose to a nozzle on the outside of the phone booth that caused the water to spray right into the person's face at high volume, rinsing away the blood by sheer volume of water that drained out the bottom to God knows where. Booming laughter announced the arrival of Santa Claus as he approached us from behind the phone booths. "Carol Jenkins," he announced. "Time to see if you've been naughty or nice." He raised the hand with the scroll, but before he let it unfurl, I called out. "Wait," I pleaded. "What kind of Santa's workshop is this?" "Santa doesn't hurt people." "The worst he does is give coal to naughty children." Looking back, I know it was a pointless question, silly even. Our captors were going to do what they intended with or without explanation. What did it matter if the man before us wasn't actually Santa Claus? Why would it matter anyway? This was supposed to be a fair with nothing but human actors. Humans don't follow Saint Nick rules. Only the truth was even worse than any of us imagined. The man dressed as Santa laughed, not his usual booming laugh, but a low, menacing laugh. "Santa Claus?" he chuckled. "What makes you think I'm Santa Claus? Is it the robe?" He stood to his full height then, and he towered above us all. He pulled back his hood and grinned like a jack-o'-lantern. "Behold," he commanded in his booming voice, "I am Krampus, and I punish the wicked." We all stared in horror at the giant before us. His face was like gnarled wood, old and weathered, with hollow features, a long pointy nose, and deep, sharp eyes that seemed to look right through us. He dropped his bag and removed his gloves, revealing gnarled, knobby hands tipped with claw-like nails. The bag opened when it fell, revealing its contents to be nothing but stout reeds and human bones. "I am not here to reward the nice list," he continued. "I bear only the naughty list. If your name is on it, you will be properly rewarded for your behavior. It will be your just reward, and justice is harsh." Carol's eyes opened wide, and her mouth worked rapidly, trying to speak, but failing to form any words. Krampus again lifted the scroll and let it unfurl. "Carol Jenkins," he announced, "you are on the naughty list." As he announced this, the elves in the room began to sing, "Naughty list, naughty list, you are on the naughty list." They surged around her and pushed and carried her to Krampus as she screamed in terror. "You are a gossip," Krampus declared. "You spread rumors and falsehoods about others without regard for the harm you're doing. You destroy people's names, reputations, and relationships with your wicked tongue." She struggled against the elves to no avail. As soon as she was close enough, Krampus reached out and snatched her up with one great, gnarled hand and pulled her in close. "As punishment, you must confess the truth to every one of your victims," he said in a threatening tone. The floor next to them opened and a new phone booth rose up. Naughty list, the elves chanted. "But you won't be using that lying tongue," he continued. "A tool of deceit has no place in honest confession." Carol struggled in his grasp and started to scream for help, but Krampus shot his free hand forward and shoved his fingers into her open mouth. Her mouth was forced open wider than it could naturally go, and her mouth tore open into a wide, jagged smile, and Krampus closed his fingers around her tongue. With a swift yank, he ripped her tongue out. Blood sprayed out of her mouth as she screamed in agony. Krampus dropped her tongue and held out his hand. A smiling elf ran forward and placed a small candy cane in it. He took the piece of candy and shoved it into Carol's mouth. The bleeding stopped instantly. It was no mercy, though, as Krampus immediately threw her into the phone booth and closed the door. "Call them," he commanded. "Once you confess your slander to all of your victims, you're free to go." Carol beat on the door, desperately trying to break free. It was pointless. She was as trapped as the rest of the people in that room. A door opened at the far end of the room. "Go," Krampus commanded, "and receive your just reward." The elves began to crowd around us again. They pushed and prodded us in the direction of the door. We reluctantly went. My wife broke down crying. Tears streamed down her face as she sobbed in great shuddering gasps. John yelled in protest about how they couldn't do this to us. I was silent. None of it mattered anyway. We were trapped, well and truly, and no amount of protest, no flood of tears would change it. We neared the door and were roughly shoved the last few steps. The door slammed shut as soon as we were through, leaving us enveloped in darkness. We waited in silence for a few moments. The darkness was oppressive, and my anxiety climbed with every second. It could be hiding literally anything, and based on the horrors of the last two rooms, that anything was certain to be deeply disturbing at best, and outright horrifying at worst. "Hello?" I called out to the darkness in a shuddering breath. As if in response, there was a slow grinding sound as part of the wall dropped down, revealing a roaring fireplace. The fire lit up the room with a dancing, scary glow. Normally it might have been comforting, but after the last two rooms, it only felt like a bad sign. In the center of the room was a big iron bed with chains at the head and foot. Instead of a mattress, there was an iron slab. The rest of the room was empty, with no signs of life. The fire blazed even higher and shot out into the room, touching the bed frame like the tongue of a hungry beast. As the fire pulled back, a familiar, horrifying figure stepped out of the flames, followed by those awful elves. Without any more introduction, Krampus held out his scroll and let it unroll. "John Valentine," he announced in that booming voice, "you are on the naughty list." The elves were on him in an instant, singing that horrible chant, naughty list, you are on the naughty list," as they grabbed him and lifted him overhead, kicking and screaming. It was useless. Small as they were, the elves' grip was like iron, and all John could do was hurt his own back and shoulders as they carried him to the bed. The elves chained him to the bed, locking iron manacles tight around his wrists and ankles. Then they pulled the chains tight to stretch him out and keep him still. He screamed in pain and fear as his shoulders and hips were dislocated with a series of loud pops. "You are guilty of adultery. Many, many times," Krampus announced with malicious glee. "You lied to cover it up. You betrayed someone close to you, used his trust, and smiled as you deceived a friend." John was screaming in protest. "It's not like that," he protested. "We're in love. You can't blame me for being in love. Love is a beautiful thing." Krampus laughed wickedly. "You continue to lie even as you face just punishment for your crimes," he declared with absolute authority. "You never loved her. You had other women even as you took what didn't belong to you over and over and over again." I was stunned. The John I knew would never do something so terrible. He was a good, upright man, and the only one I trusted completely. I turned to my wife in shock. "Who did he—" My words caught in my throat as I saw my wife, my dear Clarissa, crying, her mouth quivering with great sobs, and tears flowing like twin rivers from her bright green eyes. Her head hung in shame. "He said he loved me," she sobbed. "He promised that he would make everything better, and all of my problems would go away if I chose to be with him," she sobbed. She looked at me with profound sadness and regret. "It was me," she confessed. "I'm so sorry. It was me. The happiness I felt in our marriage wasn't there anymore, and he promised to make me happy again." Her words hit me like a bullet to the heart. My wife and my best friend, the two people in the world dearest to me, who I trusted with my life, betrayed me. Together, I felt my own tears begin to well up and pour out of my eyes. "Why?" I croaked, unable to think of anything else to say. "I still love you," she said with sincerity. "I always loved you. That never changed. But the magic was gone. I stopped being happy at the thought of you. The sweet things you do lost their magic and became routine. I wanted that happiness back. I craved the intensity of it, and he gave it to me, that's all." Her words were like a punch to the gut by a champion heavyweight boxer. I was left stunned, breathless, and unable to form a coherent thought. "Clarissa Hart," Krampus announced as if he had been waiting for this exact moment to speak. "You are on the naughty list." The elves crowded around my wife. "Naughty list! Naughty list! You are on the naughty list!" they chanted gleefully as they grabbed her, lifted her up, and began to march toward the bed. "No," I screamed. "I forgive her. I don't care what she did. We'll work it out. We'll find our happiness again. Don't take her from me. I love her." The only response I got to my pleas was a continued chant of "Naughty list, naughty list, you are on the naughty list," as those demonic elves joyfully carried my wife, kicking and screaming apologies and professions of her love for me to the iron bed. "You also are guilty of adultery, lying, and betrayal of the one person who loved and trusted you above all others," he declared. "Your crimes were committed with the condemned man. Therefore you will share his fate just as you shared your own marriage bed with him." The elves shackled and stretched her exactly as they had to John. I turned away as she screamed in pain and terror, every pop of her joints sending a shudder of sorrow and regret through my body. "You must witness this," Krampus said to me in an almost sympathetic voice. "She would have left you anyway, only to get her heart broken in betrayal. She cared far less for you than she did for her own selfish desires." I turned back to face the bed and lifted my head. All I could see through the haze of tears was a blurry vision of a black lump of iron with two patches of color on top. I heard the sound of metal grating and sliding as floor plates moved, opening a blazing pathway from the fireplace to the bed, one panel at a time. My wife and my best friend screamed even louder and began to thrash, desperation overriding the pain in their dislocated limbs as they realized what was going to happen. Over it all, I could hear the booming sound of Krampus's voice as he declared, "Your bodies will burn together just as you burned with lust together." The elves surrounded me and carried me bodily across the room to a newly opened door. They dumped me through it, and it slid shut just as I heard the screams of the two people I loved best intensify as the flames reached the underside of the bed and began to heat the iron slab they lay upon. I lay in a crumpled heap for I don't know how long, sobbing with intense sorrow at all that I lost. My friends, my wife, all gone, victims of a demonic entity meting out a twisted and final justice that nothing in me could reconcile as right or proper. We all fall short. We all make mistakes. None of us is truly innocent in this world. It's only a matter of degree and amount. Eventually I opened my eyes, stood up and looked around. I was in a cozy sitting room. There was a perfectly ordinary fireplace with a non-threatening fire cheerily popping away. There was a table set with a fine feast, There was a long, overstuffed couch. The room was festively decorated with all the trimmings of a proper Christmas celebration. In a very large chair sat the demon Krampus, patiently waiting for me to notice him. "Take a seat," he said gently, motioning to the couch with one large, bony hand. Seeing no other choice, I obeyed. "You are not on the naughty list," he declared with a soft authority, his booming, wicked voice now absent. "What?" I replied dumbly, my mind not understanding what I had just heard after seeing my wife and friends sentenced to torment and death. "You're not fully innocent," Krampus explained, "but minor mistakes do not condemn a man, so you are not on the naughty list." I sat there in stunned silence, expecting it to be some sort of cruel joke. I expected those horrible elves to show up and start chanting about me being on the naughty list as they dragged me off to be tortured and killed. It didn't happen. "Why?" I croaked after I finally found my voice. "You think I'm a demon," Krampus stated. "That's understandable, but I'm not." "I don't understand," I said softly, confused. Krampus nodded his head. "And you never truly will," he replied. "All you need to know is that I am tasked with rewarding people for the evil acts they commit. Not evil by any human understanding, but according to a universal truth that many deny even exists." "What even is that?" I asked softly. "The universe operates under certain rules," Krampus explained. "Good and evil exist because of those rules. Good is whatever follows the rules, and evil is whatever breaks them. The catch is that your kind is bound to break them. The only question is which rules you break, and how often." I don't know why, but something about being told that good and evil are universal and unchanging, that humanity has no say in the matter, made me angry. "That doesn't give you the right to just murder people," I shouted, all of my pain, sadness, and rage coming out in a single exhausting burst. I slumped back in my chair, completely spent, suddenly helpless and uncaring. "Just kill me and get it over with," I sighed. "Stop toying with me." Krampus chuckled, a real one, like he genuinely found me funny. "I'm not going to kill you," he declared with finality. "You're not on the naughty list. Instead, I'm going to give you a gift." I didn't have time to ask what he meant by gift before he was on me. He grabbed the front of my shirt with one mighty hand and lifted me up. Then, with his free hand, he pulled back his hood to reveal that among his other horrifying features, he had horns like a goat and thin, straggly hair that seemed to move on its own. He opened his mouth, and it stretched wider than any human mouth ever could, so wide that I thought he meant to eat me in a single gulp. Then he breathed. He breathed on me, a deep, sighing breath that seemed to have no end. It reeked of rotting flesh mixed with mint and cloves. I tried to hold my breath to avoid breathing the foul fumes, but it wasn't long before I found myself taking in a great gasp of air as my body overrode my mind and forced me to breathe whether I wanted to or not. At first, I felt nothing other than simple disgust. I gagged on the foul breath and coughed like my lungs wanted to jump out of my mouth. Then it subsided, and I found myself inhaling. I inhaled like never before, seeming to have no limit to how much air I could take in. I inhaled until every last foul fume that Krampus emitted was sucked in, and then he dropped me to the floor. I lay there coughing and sputtering as though my body were now rejecting the clean air after Krampus had finished fumigating me. Krampus stood looming over me like the spectre of death himself until I settled down and stood again on my own 2 feet. I looked up and saw his hood drawn far forward yet again, like it had been when I first saw him. His eyes glowed like embers in the darkness. He said nothing, waiting as if in expectation. "What now?" I asked, coughing as I spoke. A door that I had not noticed before opened up to reveal a familiar, snowy landscape. "Now you go out into the world and see it for what it truly is," he said in a voice that grew deeper and more foreboding with every word. "That is your gift. You will always know the truth about the people you meet. Never again will you be deceived." I started to speak up, to ask what he meant by his statement, but he hushed me and pointed to the door. "Go!" he commanded in that booming voice I had come to know and dread. "Leave my workshop and never return." I turned and walked out the door and into the Christmas village. Everything was as it had been before we found and entered that wicked workshop. People were blissfully enjoying the fair in the cold winter air, a recent layer of snow coating the land with a cozy frozen blanket. I turned around, and the workshop was gone. Where it once stood was a town centre filled with bustling shops and Christmas-themed carnival games. A drink vendor was off to one side, calling out for people to come and enjoy hot spiced mead and mulled wine to warm their bodies on a cold winter day. I needed a drink, and I hurried over to the vendor, fully intending to order a hot mug of mulled wine when I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. I did a double take. looking at the man in stunned disbelief. I couldn't properly explain it, but as plainly as though it was written all over his face. I knew things about the man that I had no logical way to know. I knew beyond all doubt that this was a con man. I knew that he served cheap drinks that he labeled as expensive premium ones. I knew that he was a habitual liar who lacked an honest bone in his body. I knew that he sweet-talked many gullible young women into his bed for his own amusement with false promises and declarations of affection before moving on to a new town where he did it all again. I knew that he had murdered his own mother and made it look like an accident so he could collect her life insurance before the term expired. I knew about the vial of oleander toxin he kept hidden in his inside coat pocket so he could poison the occasional drunk, knowing it would look like a heart attack and the coroner was unlikely to look any deeper. "What can I get for you?" the man said cheerily, a wide smile on his face. "Do you have anything stronger than wine?" I asked, suddenly wanting nothing to do with anything this man touched. He pointed behind me to a small building simply marked bar. "Go there if you want liquor," he said with the same cheer and smile he'd originally had. I thanked him and left, heading to the bar at first, then turning down the street and leaving, wanting nothing more than to put as much distance between myself and the Christmas village as humanly possible. Story 2. Knock, knock, knock. What the hell? I muttered to myself as I hurriedly finished putting on my pants. I wasn't expecting anyone to come by today, especially not at 6:30 in the morning while I was getting ready for work. I didn't like people showing up without warning, but my curiosity got the best of me. I cracked open the door and saw one of the most beautiful women I had ever seen in my life. Her hair was black and curly, flowing gently down to her shoulders. Her eyes were a chilly blue, but they had a warmth and kindness behind them. She wore bright red lipstick on her slightly upturned lips, a smirk on her face as she looked at me. She was dressed sharply, with a modest dress buttoned up to her neck and flowing down past her knees. She held a folder in her hands, letting it rest against her legs as she stood. She was gorgeous, the very picture of beauty, standing right on my doorstep. I immediately perked up, opening the door wider to get a better look at her. Even though I knew she could be a marketer or some other scammer, I wanted to enjoy the scene before she ruined my fantasy. "Thomas Reinhardt?" she asked, her voice both velvety and commanding. That got my attention. I sighed, slumping a bit and preparing myself for some sort of cheesy sales pitch. "Yeah, that's me. What do you want?" I asked, making my displeasure known as I leaned against the doorframe. Her smile grew a bit, stretching higher up the side of her face. "May I come in?" she asked, her eyes never leaving mine. I paused, looking her over once more. It was tempting, but I didn't want to risk letting her trap me with whatever she was promoting. I wanted to at least know what she wanted before she made me late for work. Ideally, the fun way. "Are you going to answer my question?" I asked again, trying to maintain my resolve and send her on her way. She didn't falter or move. She simply kept looking at me. Her eyes seemed to be burrowing a hole into my soul, trying to find some sort of opening she could exploit. If she was desperate, she didn't show it. There wasn't an ounce of nervousness or doubt to be seen. "May I come in?" she asked again, her voice becoming more sultry. I couldn't hide a smile this time as I took a minute to consider her. Sure, she could be some sort of murderer or just very good at her job, but I liked where this was going. Plus, she was around 5'5" and 130 pounds soaking wet, while I was over 6 feet tall and easily 250. If she was going to try anything, there was no way she could hurt me. That's what I thought, at least. "Okay, yeah, come on in. Just to warn you, though, you may not be able to handle what I have to offer." I grinned, stepping to the side to let her in. She simply giggled, stepping past me and walking inside my house. I shut the door as she walked in, turning to face her as it clicked shut. She was even more striking up close. I could even smell her perfume as she strolled past, the light scent of hyacinths gracing my nostrils as she glided past. She stopped and stood in the middle of my living room, taking a look around as she stood in the center of the room. "So this is how a big-shot lawyer lives nowadays," she cooed, turning back to look at me once more. "You can say more than just 4 words, then. I'm glad. Makes me feel better if I'm not getting into the pants of some disabled chick." I chuckled, shrugging off the fact that she knew my profession, and stepping towards her to place a hand on her waist. Her smile did not falter. She didn't move in the slightest, keeping her gaze on me. While I know that this form is something that appeals to you, this is strictly a business matter. I would apologize for leading you on, but I don't feel bad for doing what I needed to," she stated matter-of-factly, pulling my hand off her and tossing it away. She finally pushed past me, striding her way to the kitchen table. "Then you can see yourself out before I throw you out," I scoffed, all interest rapidly disappearing as I followed her. I paused, staring at her as she seemed to take in the entire room around her. I could feel my blood start to boil as she then pulled out a chair and sat down, placing the folder down in front of her. "Hey, didn't you hear me, you dumb bitch? I said leave. I don't want you and your this form nonsense in my house anymore. I'm not against throwing you out either," I growled, towering over her as I quickly closed the distance. She looked up at me again, not even allowing a crack in her facade. "I assure you, Mr. Reinhardt, this will be much easier if you cooperate. We have much to discuss," she said, seemingly oblivious to the size difference as she grinned wider up at me. I was speechless. How dare she sit in my house, refuse to leave, and act like everything was fine? How did this delusional woman think this was going to go? That I would give up and let her do her stupid presentation or whatever it was she wanted from me? Well, that wasn't going to happen. "Nope, you're out of here," I spat angrily, grabbing her by the shoulder to lead her out of my home. Immediately, a searing pain spread through my arm. It felt like my arm was being attacked by rabid piranhas, ripping and tearing away my flesh as they climbed up my arm. I screamed, letting go and sinking to my knees. I watched as my sleeve slowly sloughed off my arm, revealing lines of black snaking up my arm like vines up a tree. They stopped short of my armpit, pulsating and throbbing and wriggling like worms around my bicep. "Didn't anyone tell you not to lay a malicious hand on a woman?" she asked, the smile melting off her face as the warmth in her voice faded into a cold, monotone drone. I watched in horror as her appearance slowly began to change. Her eyes lost their light, turning grey and milky. Her hair fell out in clumps, leaving her head patchy and bald in some spots. Her skin lost its glow, turning a sickly pale colour with black rot creeping up her fingertips. The smell of flowers was overtaken by the smell of decay, filling the room with the nauseating scent of death. I quickly got to my feet, breaking into a sprint as her cold, dead eyes watched my every move. I rushed through the living room, unlocking and throwing open the door to run. The door immediately slammed shut in front of me, with this woman now standing in front of me and blocking my path. I didn't even see her move, as if she simply appeared in front of me. I turned around to try to get away, but was confronted by her once again, face to face. I screamed, scrambling backward until my back pressed against the door. She kept up with me, making sure to keep the distance close until we were inches away. I was utterly trapped. She leaned in close, stopping inches away. The smell became overwhelming as her features became skeletal. Her skin became taut and thin. Her eyes dribbled out of their sockets, and her teeth clattered onto the floor as they fell out of her mouth. Her voice came out as an airy hiss, her words floating around my head before piercing my ears. There was only one word on her non-existent lips. "Sit." I reluctantly went back to the table and sat across from the woman, trying my best to avoid looking at her empty eye sockets that were somehow burning a hole in my forehead. The pain in my arm started to fade once I took a seat, but long black streaks were now burned into my arm, raised and angry as they snaked up and down my forearm and bicep. I kept my eyes firmly on the table, trying my best to keep down the building panic twisting in my gut. I heard the rustle of papers being removed from the folder, the tapping of paper against the table, then silence. "Are you the Grim Reaper?" The question tumbled out of me before I could stop it. I am far more powerful than an envoy. I do not merely lead people to their fate. Her voice was airy and old, cracking and straining as if unused for decades. It filled the room with a primordial dread and sorrow, bearing down on me with a crushing weight of understanding. "Are you Death? That is one name that was given to me. You may refer to me as such if it brings closure more rapidly." She paused, letting her words hang in the air like a cloud of smog before continuing. "It is time to discuss why I'm here," the woman hissed, her dry voice unreadable as she slid a paper into view. The paper, despite her appearance, was strangely normal, clean, unwrinkled, and slightly warm to the touch. It was like someone printed out a legal document and handed it to me. I picked it up, carefully reading the document. "This document is for the recipient Thomas Reinhardt to discuss the manner and matter of his upcoming death." "My death? Is this some kind of sick joke?" I snorted, my voice frigid but my gaze unmoving. I'm afraid not, Mr. Reinhardt. This is a discussion as old as the cosmos, and your only opportunity to decide on your fate, she said, an odd rattle of life returning to her voice as she spoke. I looked up at her, just in time to see her appearance change again. Her features softened as her hair, skin, and eyes returned to their former splendor. Her expression was still very matter-of-fact, but I now saw a wise, ancient look behind her gaze. You have to be. Discussing my death? Why not just kill me in my sleep or hit me with a bus? I scoffed again, sliding the paper back towards her. I'm afraid those fates are unearned. She droned, sliding the paper back towards me to emphasize her point. Unearned? I didn't earn the right to die by bus. I looked back down at the paper, noticing that her finger was pointing to two choices. The recipient, due to the deeds and actions within their lifespan, may choose between dying in a house fire or being beaten to death by a stranger. My eyes widened as an audible gasp spilled out of my lips. These were horrific options, absolutely barbaric ways to die. I had to choose between being beaten or burning alive. Why these deaths? Why now? Why do I have to choose between these deaths? Okay, there must be a mistake. These are violent and cruel. Surely there is something better than that you can offer me. I laughed coldly, sliding the paper away before meeting her gaze. She did not laugh. This is it. These are your fates. This decision was made using a variety of choices that you made and the circumstances behind them. Your fate is fair and reflects your character on Earth, she stated plainly, opening the envelope in front of her and pulling out another piece of paper as she spoke. The choices that I made? That seems a little dramatic. What were these decisions anyway that caused you to give me such a terrible deal? I challenged, leaning on the table towards her. I dared her, in that moment, to give me any room to argue for something nice and peaceful. She slid a piece of paper in front of me silently, resting her fingers on the page momentarily before slowly withdrawing them. I looked down at the paper, freezing as I read the contents. The page was filled with words and numbers. Everything was spaced out evenly and in a well-organized fashion, with dozens of entries spanning down the length of the page. It was a list of all the times that I stole from others, the small sums, the big illegal acts I got away with, and all the other ways I lined my pockets at the expense of others. The page was divided by dates and times, listed out point by point. Next to the times sat a small summary of events. October 5th, 2022, 11:37. Told client that balance remained for services. Pocketed cash. November 22nd, 2022, 15:13. Falsely claimed share of inheritance of deceased client. April 30th, 2023, 10:58. Undermined then claimed co-worker's client and billable hours. September 16th, 2023, 07:50. Embezzled funds from the pro bono project you ran. It went on for what seemed like several years. I blinked, shocked that I was staring at information that I had no idea she could have had access to. How did she get this? There was no way she could have gotten this without being who she said she was. However, dying in a fire based on some stolen funds, that seemed absurd. So I took money from people. I stole, and I know that it was wrong, but I started. She jumped in before I could continue. You robbed the poor to fill your greedy belly. You took food out of the mouths of children and birthrights away from the inherited. You preyed upon the desperate, the ones in need, the ones who needed your help in a time of great turmoil. You used your position of power to abuse those who trusted you. She reached out a finger, slowly running it down the page. From the time you were accepted to the bar until yesterday. Her finger stopped at the bottom of the page, pointing to the last entry. December 10th, 2024, 14:02, falsely reported a client to authorities to claim reward money. Shit. I did what I thought was right. I didn't know that... Come now, Tom. You are a smart boy. You knew that he didn't match the description. You knew that the story he gave you didn't line up with the person they were looking for. She giggled without humor, her voice cold and accusing. And she was right. I did know better. I knew that giving him up would condemn an innocent man to a lifetime of confinement. Okay, so I stole. That doesn't justify these fates, I argued, pointing back to the document off to the side. She waved her hand above the paper in front of me. The paper burst into flames and burned up into a plume of smoke within seconds, wafting up and disappearing into thin air. You're correct, Mr. Reinhardt. Theft alone does not justify the fates offered. Even the most egregious acts of theft can eventually be made right. Money changes hands often, and your estate would correct the wrongs of the past when you pass. She then slid another piece of paper in front of me, this time showing an image. It was a selfie with 3 people smiling into the camera. I was in the middle, with 2 women sitting on either side of me. I immediately recognized the women as my ex-wife and her best friend. Both were smiling into the camera, with my wife leaning her head on my shoulder in the picture. I suppose calling them best friends would be inaccurate now. They were best friends. That was true at one point. They had grown up together since they were in diapers. That was until my ex-wife caught us in bed together when she came home from work early. It had been going on for a few months by that point, and we had gotten sloppy. My wife never suspected a thing, as we passed under the radar with just a passing glance and a nod. The divorce came shortly after and was brutal for everyone. I dragged my heels, hoping to convince her to forgive my mistake, but she eventually pushed it through. She got our savings and the house, while I kept the car and half of the bank account. She and her best friend had a permanent falling out when everything came to light. I also lost contact with my affair partner, as she blamed me for losing her best friend. This was a month ago. This picture was taken shortly before it all fell apart, when they were both still happy and inseparable. I was silent, feeling a pang of guilt as I looked at the photo. "I assume you understand why I show you this picture," the woman said, not as a question, but as an undeniable fact. "Yeah, I do." I swallowed, pushing the picture out of sight to avoid the memories. "Oh no. Can you not stand looking at what you did?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she slid the paper back into view. "Am I not allowed to feel remorse?" I asked in disgust, sliding the paper away from me and towards her voice to make my point. A pause, then the sound of flames and the smell of burnt paper. "I suppose you could, if you actually felt bad. However, I would bet that you are more upset about being caught than actually hurting people," the woman said, her voice stony. "How dare you?" I asked, standing up from my chair and causing it to topple to the floor as I felt anger bubble out of my chest. I looked up to glare at her, a bright and hot fury burning in my chest. She looked back at me, looking absolutely bored with the interaction. She didn't move, simply leaning against the back of the chair as if talking about the weather. "Did you tell her yourself?" "What?" I asked, taken aback by her lack of reaction. "Did you tell her yourself?" The woman smirked a bit, her eyes icy blue and sharp. The accusation behind them was palpable, practically dripping out of every pore on her arrogant face. "No, because I didn't want to hurt her. I also didn't deny it when she asked me and gave her the closure she needed," I countered, stepping closer to her as my confidence began to build. She stood as well, crossing her arms as she looked me up and down. Then, with a startling snort, she burst into laughter. I stood there, absolutely dumbfounded, as she belly laughed for what felt like several minutes before she regained her composure. "That excuse never gets old," she giggled, the laughs finally dying down enough for her to speak again. "What do you mean?" I asked, my confidence withering at the sudden outburst of laughter. "You think that because you didn't tell her, you were saving her from the pain of finding out that the one person she is, supposed to trust the most in the world, violated that trust in the most fundamental way?" she asked, taking a step closer to me. I instinctively took a step back, but she continued, closing the distance. "You think that you didn't want to hurt her, while knowing that this act would likely ruin her friendship beyond any hope of repair. You didn't want to hurt her when you actively hid the affair for several months and tried to cover your tracks while indulging your desires. Do you think it matters when 2 hearts were broken due to your negligent malice?" She was now directly in front of me. She was physically imposing despite being much shorter than me, leaving no space between us. I had backed into the wall, shrinking further into the wallpaper as she got closer. Her eyes were back to that dead white gloss, with her sneer bigger than should be possible for her face. "You broke the vow of holy matrimony. You committed adultery and destroyed 2 lives. I would have far more respect for you if you just said you wanted a little on the side than giving me that sorry excuse. You would at least be honest." Bah. She was suddenly back at the table, as if being chopped out of existence and placed back in her chair. Her legs were crossed, and she was relaxed, her eyes returning to their icy blue hue. "Well, I guess we should make those 3 women's lives you personally ruined," she sighed, sliding the envelope across the table to the spot in front of the toppled chair. I took a few seconds to compose myself, feeling my heart race and my vision get blurry. I eventually trudged back to the table, picking the chair up off the floor and taking a seat. I opened the envelope, sliding out the final picture from inside. Instantly, everything went cold. I felt nauseous as a stoic face stared back at me. The face was that of a young man, 16 years old. His hair was messy, and he stared directly into the camera. He looked as though he was woken up to take this photo, with his eyes half awake and generally bleary. The background was plain, with only sporadic, evenly spaced lines marking up the wall. This was me. This was a mugshot of mine before my dad sealed my record and got the rape charges dropped. God, I wish I could say that I remember what happened that night. I wish I could say that I remembered her name, but I can't. The only thing I remember is going to a party, drinking, seeing her that night, and her screaming and begging for me to stop. I remember the scratches, the running, the disappointment on my dad's face. I remember taking this mugshot, though. I was pulled out of my house by two stern-looking cops, brought to the station, and booked. I stayed for a little over a week until my dad convinced the chief to drop the case and seal my record to not ruin my future. The chief claimed lack of evidence, but he might as well have said that his drinking buddy called in a favor. It was actually a major reason why we moved out of the small town I grew up in and to the city. I put the paper back down on the table, a rock tumbling in my gut as she spoke. Everywhere you go, everything you do, broken people and ruined lives lie in your wake. You wonder why you have to suffer when you die. You lie, steal, cheat, and rob others of their sovereignty. You are lucky that you aren't being disemboweled, she said, her voice pointed and poisonous. I looked up just in time to see her grin, savoring my pain and fear. Not yet, anyway. Isn't there something I can do to make this better? Surely there is some way to make this more humane. I almost yelled, my panic palpable as I felt the walls begin to close around me. She tilted her head as if curious at my stubbornness despite overwhelming evidence. You had an entire lifetime to decide your fate, an entire lifetime to develop the virtues and sins that follow your existence. You have chosen long before your fate was decided. This fate is inevitable, she said, seemingly irritated that I was grasping at straws despite the finality of my fate. What if I changed today? What if I dedicated the rest of my days to... She cut me off with a loud slam against the tabletop. I jumped as the air was filled with the smell of smoke, feeling the heat of the flames before they abruptly vanished. Her eyes, while back to being a cloudy white, burned with a rage that I had not seen before or since. Her hand was still pressed firmly against the table, a thin, frail finger poking into the paper as she pointed to a line. The recipient's fate upon receiving the notice shall be carried out at 5 a.m. tomorrow. The day and time were filled in manually, the handwriting pristine and gorgeous against the ominous words that preceded it. Tomorrow. Tomorrow I die. I felt all the blood drain from my face as I realized how doomed I was. Even if I could completely turn my life around, I did not have time. My fate was set in stone and it was hopeless to fight it. What if I don't choose? That's an option, right? I could just not choose and then you won't have any way to know how I die, I stammered, feeling a sudden rise of indignation in my chest. After all, this wasn't fair. I shouldn't have to choose between two gruesome deaths because I made some mistakes. There has to be a better way, a peaceful way, a more dignified way. She was silent for a long while, seemingly thinking. Her expression was hard to read, as if I was staring at a stone wall. Suddenly, she was directly in front of me. It was as if she had teleported, as my eyes didn't even see a twitch of a muscle before she moved. She had climbed on top of the table, sitting on her knees with her face inches from mine. The light in her eyes was gone again, yet her lips stretched into a large grin. She looked absolutely giddy, her eyes shining with an excitement found only in the thoughts that brought pure euphoria. Her hand was placed against my chest, gentle yet tinged with malicious intent, as if she were going to yank my heart out of my chest. If you don't choose, then I get to. If that happens, I am not bound to the choices that I have offered you. I will be allowed to pull from any death that you can and cannot fathom. Pain and suffering that can seem to stretch into eons. Pain that will have you begging for death. Fates that have happened for centuries or have never been seen, she giggled, tightly gripping onto my shirt as I tried to pull away. I promise that it will be my magnum opus, something truly beautiful to behold. She cooed the words, her voice purring with an almost lustful tone. I felt her finger on her other hand slowly glide against my neck as she spoke. Something sharp dragged against my throat, stopping against the artery in my neck. I shivered, choking down a sob as she tapped impatiently. Maybe I should take the choice away. Why should cruel men like you get the luxury of choice when you deprive others of their autonomy? She asked. Her words pointed as the sharp point pressed against my vein. The thin skin of my neck barely kept the point at bay, threatening to drain my blood in seconds if cut. Just as suddenly, she was gone. The pressure eased, with relief quickly washing over me. I released the breath I didn't know I was holding, collapsing against the tabletop as the rest of my strength sapped away. I heard the door creak open before she called back to me. "You have until midnight to decide, or I will decide for you." With that, the door slammed shut. This all happened yesterday. I don't know what to do. It is 11:50 p.m. and I don't know what to do. Should I feel the agony of my body burning and eventually suffocate on soot and smoke? Should I pick a fight I know I can't win and feel the terror of the world going black in a flurry of punches? Please help me. I know that I have not been a good man. Hell, I know that I have been an awful man. I know that for all my accomplishments, my faults have defined my life. I know that. I'm not asking for sympathy or forgiveness. I am asking for a decision, some clarity in a situation I know I won't make it out of alive. Please. Oh God, she's back. I heard her. Just a light creak of the floorboard as she sneaks through the house. She has probably already planned out her magnum opus, with me as the sickening finale to her symphony of horror and agony. I can see her now, her milky white eyes piercing the dark as she stares at me. She's just waiting for the clock to run out. Then she will be given the power to unleash untold fates that I no longer control. Please help me. I'm almost out of time. Story 3. Gaia, who created the earth, was and is not a kind being. She was the mother of Kronos, after all. Those who explore the unknown secrets she and her son made within the depths of the world will not find wealth or glory. Instead, they will find mystery, madness, and most likely death. Andrew, Emily, Evelyn, Douglas and I were all students at the University of Exeter. Douglas was studying mechanical engineering. Emily was studying geography. Andrew was studying history. Evelyn was studying philosophy, and I was studying medicine. We were all struggling with our workloads. During exam season, Douglas suggested, "We should really go on a trip so we aren't wasting our lives reading books, textbooks, and ancient history books of no note. There's only so much Gibbon you can read before it gets dull." Douglas was a reckless person and was obsessed with his passion project of working on a 1980s Jeep bought for £300 at an auction. He insisted it would run beautifully once he finished his alterations and repairs. We were all young, just out of adolescence. I was 22, and the rest were 21, almost turning 22 themselves. I said, "To be honest, Doug, despite how silly you are, that isn't the worst suggestion you've ever made," which amused the group, and we agreed on the week-long trip. We decided to go to the coast since the beaches around Exeter were beginning to bore us. We settled on our destination being a cottage on the southwestern coast of Cornwall in a small village called Anglesand, which Doug had read about in one of his car magazines. He insisted we set off as early as possible, saying, "I'm not quite sure if these headlights will last too long, and the battery isn't fantastic." This filled us all with apprehension, but as reckless as we were, the plan seemed good enough. I was the one to pack for the journey. I didn't plan particularly well. I packed summer gear, some raincoats, because it was England after all, enough blankets for us all in case the cottage was undersupplied, and 2 sleeping bags, along with a set of food, and obviously booze, some bottles of whiskey, too many cans of beer, and a couple of bottles of wine for when we felt fancy. I perhaps should have packed some tools and even some binoculars for spotting birds and, eventually, our final elusive hope of rescue. Setting off early in the morning, as Doug suggested, much to Emily's annoyance, she said, "Why couldn't we just leave at midday? It's summer. It doesn't even get dark until near 10 p.m. Douglas responded, "Because despite how fantastic an engineer I am, I don't trust the headlights, and I'm quite frankly shocked the car passed the MOT. This did nothing to calm Emily's nerves about Doug's engineering skills, but as we rolled through the English countryside in pleasant weather, Emily fell asleep on my shoulder. I had been crushing on her since I met her 3 years prior, so maybe my flirtatious attitude was finally paying off. She was a beautiful brunette with stunning hazel eyes. The moment I saw her, I was smitten. While we travelled through the beautiful rural English summer countryside, Andrew grew bored and brought out a book he had borrowed from the university library, describing the history of Anglesand. Andrew began talking, with most of us ignoring him out of disinterest. Anglesand was founded in the 4th century AD by the Romans. apparently drawn to the area by the hot pools and easy access for trade back to Gaul and even Rome itself. But they abandoned the town shortly after establishing it, and it was later inhabited by the Anglo-Saxons, who seem to have done the same. The history ends there. Odd, but maybe the chronicler got bored of this project and moved on before finalizing his last edit. None of us cared about Andrew's rambling, and we continued to enjoy the views of the English countryside. Our group arrived in Anglesey in the late afternoon and went straight to our cottage. Evelyn took 20 minutes to figure out the process of opening the rusted keybox. She was neither handy nor precise, which is why we tasked her with this as a sort of joke. During this time, we discussed what we should do on our week-long trip. Douglas suggested we should visit the town hall. From what I read, it sounded beautiful and well preserved. I suggested the church first, as it was the primary building of the village, but sadly, Emily overruled me. Maybe our budding romance wasn't going as well as I thought. Once Evelyn finally opened the aged keybox, I said, and Doug agreed. We should take an early night and begin exploring in the morning. However, our party had endured our final exams that week, and despite Doug and I's protestations to catch an early night's sleep, we ended up drinking and playing cards and drinking games late into the night. Andrew was the last to pass out on the couch after finishing off a bottle of rum he had brought privately. When we eventually awoke, surprisingly early, with me being the first to wake with a shocking headache, I began making the classic hungover task of preparing breakfast. I probably annoyed the group by shouting, "Breakfast is ready," which in a small cottage probably wasn't necessary. We sat down, drank some coffee to help our hangovers, and ate the mix of food I had prepared. Bacon sandwiches, toast with Marmite, butter and jam, and the best item in my opinion, some croissants I had made the day before. I had meant to bring a pancake mix, but in our hurry, I had left it at home. First on our list of sites to visit was the infamous town hall. We were surprised to find it dilapidated and in poor condition, not the well-maintained and beautiful building Doug had described. Evelyn found this hilarious and said while stifling laughter, "Doug, I know you always think you're right, but I don't think you can tell your left hand from your right." Doug, clearly annoyed, commented, "Well, I only read a magazine about this place, making the magazine wrong, not me. I'm always right." We all disagreed, but figured we shouldn't inflame Doug further by continuing what was becoming an argument. I tried to defuse the situation, saying, "Come on, guys, this is meant to be a holiday, not a riot and bout of arguments." This diffused the group's tension a bit, and Emily gave me a pleasant smile for my unusually neat handling of the situation, unusual for me being quite non-confrontational normally. The growing confrontation settled for now. We finally decided to do what we had intended, explore the town hall. I said, "We should probably be wearing masks or something, it's a bit damp." Doug retorted, "Shut up with your medical nonsense. A bit of damp has never harmed anyone." Almost falling through some rotten floorboards, we made our way to the center of the town hall. There wasn't much of interest really, just some charming paintings on the walls, and some inscriptions in Latin which Andrew found fascinating. Not knowing Latin, he took a photo for later examination. Bored and seeing pleasant weather through the dusty windows, we decided to head to the beach, one of our original intentions for the trip, to enjoy some beers and maybe even brave the cool Atlantic waters. We hopped in Doug's car, figuring that it being a small village, a bit of slightly drunken driving wouldn't be too risky. The trip to the beach was short, although Doug's car was showing signs that his alterations hadn't exactly improved its performance. I joked that the car was a pile of rust and rubbish, which didn't help Doug's mood, but I thought it was humorous nonetheless. We settled down on the beach with blankets, beers, and some snacks I had brought from Exeter. We lounged there for hours, even venturing into the unusually warm sea, which left us all a bit confused, especially Emily. Being a young geographer, she thought the water was far too warm for this time of year, or any time of year at all. Eventually, it began to grow dark, and Evelyn insisted we get back to the cottage before it was too dark, probably remembering Doug's comment about his headlights. We made it back safely, and after the day's excursion, we were tired and actually followed my advice from the night before, settling into a pleasant sleep before midnight. We awoke at the crack of dawn, unusual for students and especially for the night owl Emily. We had a quick breakfast and I quietly suggested, maybe we should visit the church early today so we can have another nice day on the beach or even visit the cliffs above. The group agreed, with Doug being especially excited since the town hall and church were his main reasons for visiting the town. Little did we know, this is where our happy holiday would take a turn for the worse. The church was a short walk from the cottage, but at this point we realized we had not seen a single person since arriving in the village. Evelyn was the first to mention this, saying, "I thought this village was meant to be a tourist hotspot, at least based on your magazine, Doug." Doug, ever defensive of his planning, said, "Well, there was an advertisement for a village festival this week, and they probably just got a bit too jolly and are sleeping off their drinking. Maybe it's even turned into a camping trip. We might not see them all week." This seemed reasonable to me. Small villages often host these kinds of events, similar to the ones up in the Highlands of Scotland near Lochs Tay and Lomond. Upon reaching the church, it was a beautiful sight, clad with aged marble, with intricate carvings and small, albeit aged, statues of ancient characters: Moses, Christ, and strangely, Icarus, famed for flying too close to the sun and falling to his death. None of this bothered the group except for Andrew, who knew about Icarus and grew slightly unnerved, believing their fates might be intertwined. Inside the church was, again, similar to the town hall, dilapidated and clearly unkempt. But it had fascinating statues: a masterfully crafted statue of Caesar during his death throes on the Ides of March, situated beside a small statuette of Romulus and Remus being weaned by their surrogate wolf mother, this being an originally Roman church, a painting of the Vestal Virgins, and other less unusual things you would find in a church. Emily exclaimed, "Despite the state of this place, it is absolutely beautiful. Someone should really come back to this village and fix it up, even put it on Homes Under the Hammer." I was the only one to laugh and agree to this sarcastic suggestion, continuing my flirtatious attitude towards Emily. Meanwhile, the others found something peculiar. Some floorboards, all rotten within the building similar to the town hall, seemed to have been recently placed and heavily secured. Doug and Andrew agreed to dig up the boards to see what was hidden beneath, maybe ancient treasure or some secret from the elder days. Andrew, ever the scholarly man, said, "These old churches tend to have large crypts filled with corpses and coffins of wealthy men. Worth checking out for sure." I didn't agree. This church seemed strange. There was a strange odor in the air and a faint whisper only I could hear coming from beneath the floors of the church. Doug, ever the handyman, eventually broke through the boards, revealing a set of stairs leading to a crypt of sorts. The group followed silently, noticing a wall of skulls with a door set between them in almost perfect symmetry. Emily remembered a passage from a story she had read as a child and, unusually not skittish, said, "These skulls likely belonged to the priests and noblemen of the time. It was meant to be an honor to be entombed in such a noble church." While Emily was talking, Andrew discovered scrolls and ancient books in a partition of the crypt, which he packed into his rucksack to read later back at the cottage. I, not normally suspicious, was growing wary of this crypt. I guess that's what being surrounded by partial corpses does to a young man. Doug, along with Andrew, decided to break down the door centered between the wall of skulls. What they found inside shocked us all, even Doug. It was a closed room with skeletons wearing old togas. There was an image of the cross drawn in blood, bordered by a picture of a three-headed demon. There was also an image of Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guarded the entrance to the underworld. It was a mix of Christian and ancient Greek symbols. I, strangely for me, said, "The men buried here were probably imprisoned for some terrible crime or sacrilegious act, and went mad in the darkness they were confined within." We figured we had explored enough and, all quite spooked by the whole affair, decided to leave and head back to the cottage or beach for some rest. While walking back through the church, making sure to stay on the steadiest floorboards, Andrew suddenly fell through the floor. The group, obviously worried for our friend, carefully made our way to the hole where Andrew had fallen, calling out his name as we went. The floorboards had concealed a chasm. We thought it might be an old well, but Emily suggested flippantly, given the likely death of our friend, maybe this is why they founded this town, being built on an extinct volcano with warm pools nearby, mentioned in that magazine of yours, Doug. The group had no response, and despite her calm reaction to Andrew's sudden fall, Emily began to sob. Eventually, she said we should leave the village immediately before anything else horrible happened, and our smaller group agreed. By this point, we were all distraught at the presumed death of Andrew and the increasingly supernatural nature of the village, still not having seen a single person. We packed up the car and drove back the way we came, with Doug being cautious since his alterations were proving not very efficient. After an hour, we noticed we had passed the same signs multiple times. Then, to our horror, we saw "Welcome to Anglesand." We had returned to the village, the opposite of our failed escape attempt. It was growing dark, and exhausted by the day's strange events, we retired early. Emily and I slept in the same bed as she was the most unsettled and needed company. Despite everything, I was pleased to finally be close to the girl I had dreamed of being with for years. None of us slept well, dreaming of demons and creatures of the night that terrified us all. Meanwhile, Andrew regained consciousness at the bottom of the chasm he had fallen into earlier. He had a broken leg, a light concussion, and was confused about his location. A glowing red light beckoned him further into the cave. Despite his injuries, Andrew's curiosity got the better of him. He staggered towards the light as quickly as he could with his broken leg. What he found was shocking. The volcano beneath Anglesand was not inactive but highly active, with liquid magma and fumes spitting from the pool of boiling rock directly beneath the town. Andrew recalled the original townspeople's exodus and realized in a spitting gasp of anguish that the Romans entombed within the tomb were maddened by the fumes from the deep volcanic stream. The following Anglo-Saxons, having no knowledge of this, resettled the town and likely succumbed to the same fate. Hearing whispers and approaching heavy footsteps with a sense of dread, Andrew, exhausted, bruised, and broken, sat down against one of the warm rocks of the cave and passed into a peaceful sleep from which he never awakened. We woke up on the fourth day, and Doug, ambitious as ever, tried starting up his glorious Jeep, but his additions were insufficient, and the engine only lasted halfway to the cliff we had planned on reaching for aid and rescue. Despite this, Evelyn said nervously, but with a firm tone, "We need to do something, or we'll be stuck here till we die. And why are there no people here? I just don't understand," I responded. "I agree this is turning into a disaster, but we should stay positive. Maybe the people will return from the festival and direct us home." This did little to console our group, and we headed to the cliff, carrying the bare necessities, the last of our whiskey, wine, beer, and what little food remained. Upon reaching the cliff, we found it was warm, similar to a lightly heated blanket. Emily, always ready with an explanation for anything geographical, suggested maybe the volcano isn't inactive and is what drove the people from the town. We couldn't disagree, as none of us had a better explanation. We set up a small camp. I had neglected to bring a tent, and made a fire with wood from the benches in the church, hoping to flag down a boat. We slept roughly that night, with Emily and I huddling together under multiple blankets, and Doug and Evelyn claiming the sleeping bags and sleeping closely together. Once again, we woke up and, in a surprising change of our fate, spotted a boat. Ecstatic with our change in fortune, we flagged the ship down as it approached slowly. We stripped down to the bare minimum and slid down the cliff into the warm Atlantic Sea. We swam in circles, embraced in joy, awaiting the boat to arrive and save us from our horrible fate. Sadly, the boat never came, and was likely an illusion caused by the same madness that claimed the previous inhabitants of the town. Andrew was the only member of the group to suffer a similar fate, probably deceased or turned into the very demon that cursed the town. What occurred afterward we will never know, but if you ever see a sign directing you toward Anglesand, do not follow it and immediately turn around, as you will likely never return.